Good evening. I'm Giulio Dalvit, the Assistant Curator of Sculpture at the Frick Collection in New York. Thank you for joining me tonight for another episode of Cocktails with a Curator. Tonight I want to talk to you about this rather small marble portrait bust of the Comtesse du Cayla, the Countess of Kaila. Her maiden name was Élisabeth-Suzanne de Jaucourt, and she was only just a girl, a 20-year-old girl, when she was portrayed here in this marble bust by the French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon. Houdon is still celebrated for his effigies of the great men of the French 18th and early 19th century, the age of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and ultimately the Napoleonic Empire. And here, for example, you see a portrait of a bust of Jean-Jacques Rousseau on the left and Voltaire on the right. But Houdon's story is also something of an American story, because in the early 1780s, he was asked by Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin to come to America to carry out a major commission of a full-length marble statue of George Washington. And he did so. He traveled all the way from France to America, across the Atlantic. He went to Mount Vernon, met with Washington, took a life mask of his face, which you still see on the left, because amazingly, it survives to this day at the Morgan Library in New York, so you can go and see it. Houdon used the mask not just to carry out the full-length statue, which you see on the right, which was meant to be and has always been at the capital of the state of Virginia in Richmond, but also to carve a number of busts of Washington that are scattered across America and really across the globe. And this contributed to creating something of an official iconography for George Washington in the newborn United States of America. So Houdon is really as important in France as he is in the States. But tonight I don't want to talk about Houdon's portraits of great men, but rather the portrait of this little-known 18th century woman. And before doing that, I want to concentrate with you on two little details, which really set, in a way, the emotional tone of this marble bust that actually surpasses and outshines most of Houdon's portraits of men, precisely because this is the portrait of a woman, probably, because he didn't have to create an official stately iconography. There is much more intimacy in this portrait of Madame du Cayla. And it's an intimacy which speaks in a way of summer, of flowery summers in the south of France, as we will see later. And I want to concentrate with you on these two little details: the spray of grape leaves across her chest and her hair strewn with flowers, which really evokes summer for me. And I wanted to pair tonight's episode with a cocktail which is known as a Frosé, which is just frozen rosé wine, strawberries, lemon juice, and a touch of sugar. It's very simple, but delicious and very refreshing. So cheers. Why is this portrait of Madame de Kaila so special? It is special because it's a wonderful example of Houdon's virtuoso carving of marble. He can go from very smooth, polished surfaces of the skin, for example, to rougher, coarser surfaces for the hair. He can go from thin veils of marble for the grape leaves, and imagine how difficult it is to carve this marble so thin, to thicker masses of marble for the hair. And really here you see Houdon defying the hard texture of marble, achieving so many different effects in the same area, on the same bust. And it is impossible almost to imagine that this actually came originally as one marble block. to Houdon's studio. And if we concentrate on the hair, we also see that Houdon manages to sculpt not just marble, but also light. He manages to create these areas of deep shadow that articulate the volumes of this wonderfully cascading hair on the back of Madame de Kaila in such a wondrous way. Beyond that, beyond the artistic achievements of this marble bust, there is one detail that has always puzzled scholars, and it's this spray of grape leaves, which I've already mentioned. Why is it there? There's three different hypotheses. The first one is that it's a reference to the surname of Madame de Kaila's husband's family, the Basquis. Madame de Kaila married her own cousin, actually, Hercule Etienne Philippe de Basquis. And the Basquis name sort of rhymes with the name Bacchus, the god of wine. And there is a branch of grape leaves which features in the coat of arms of the Basquis family. So this might be a reference to the name Basquis and their coat of arms. And this is not new in Houdon's oeuvre. We see that, for example, here in this portrait of Mademoiselle Olivier, which came out of Houdon's workshop, we can see that he plays with the name Olivier with this branch of olive tree that cuts across the chest of Madame Olivier. But there is a second hypothesis, which does not exclude the previous one, but is more interesting and more compelling. And that's that Madame de Kaila is portrayed here as a bacchante. And that's also the interpretation that contemporary viewers gave of this object. When this was first shown at the Parisian Salon in 1777, a visitor to the Salon wrote in his diaries, and I'm going to quote, "We see in Madame la Comtesse du Cayla the sweet drunkenness, the lively gaiety, the frivolous abandonment of a bacchante at the beginning of an orgy during the first moments of pleasure." He might have gone a step too far with the interpretation of his of this bust, but it is true that if we compare this bust with, for example, this portrait of Lady Hamilton, which is now in Liverpool by Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, we realize that this was very fashionable at the time. 18th century women had themselves portrayed as bacchantes, so priestesses of the god Bacchus, the god of wine, drunkenness, and also ecstasy. And we see here Lady Hamilton, who was the long-term lover of Lord Nelson and the artistic muse of the painter George Romney. And you can still see at the Frick a portrait of Lady Hamilton as nature by Romney. But here, in this comparison with the portrait by Vigée-Lebrun, we realize that not only is Madame de Kaila portrayed as a bacchante, but she is a running bacchante. We see her hair and the cloak floating in the wind behind her. And this is extraordinary if you think about it, because it means that Houdon plays with busts, which are the most static, rigid kind of representation ever, and turns this into a figure in movement. He catches this woman while she's running. He manages to freeze this instant in stone forever. And this is truly amazing. It means that he's pushing bust portraiture to its structural and conceptual limits, really. And it's funny that you can only realize this as you move yourself as a viewer around the sculpture and you look at it from the side, because from the front, you will never be able to realize that she's actually running away from something. So this very powerful bust also manages to prompt you as a viewer to turn and to move around this figure in movement. So this is really an outstanding achievement for Houdon. There is also a more prosaic explanation, let's say, of why the grape leaves might be included in the bust, and that's that the Basquis family owned vast estates in southern France, in Languedoc. And here you see the wonderful Chateau du Cayla at Andillac in southern France. And they also owned vast vineyards, which produced huge amounts of wine. And so it might be also a reference to one of the main sources of income for the Basquis family, the presence of these grape leaves. And the portrait of Madame du Cayla is really part of a family history in a way, because in the same year, 1777, Houdon also made a bust of du Cayla's mother, the Comtesse de Jaucourt, which you see here, and it's at the Louvre now on the right. They are very different. They're different in attitude because you go from the frivolous gaiety of Madame de Kaila to this very severe and austere, algid figure of the Comtesse de Jaucourt. And they are also ill-matched in terms of size. The Comtesse de Kaila is slightly smaller, which tells us that probably they weren't conceived as a pair. But still, we see also in the Comtesse de Jaucourt kind of a reference to antiquity. She's definitely not wearing contemporary dress. And she has this sash that cuts across her chest, which might be a reference to the figure of Diana, for example, which you see on the right, this wonderful full-length marble sculpture by Houdon, and the terracotta version is obviously at the Frick, and you might have seen it. But whether or not she's Diana or she may be an Amazon, for example, still she is resolved by Houdon as an ancient figure. In 1777, Houdon showed a number of busts at the Parisian Salon of that year. And we know that because we have lists of all the exhibits of the Salon of that year, and we see all the busts by Houdon. You can see that the portrait of Madame du Cayla is listed, as is that of her mother. But there is also a mysterious portrait, the Madame de, and then 3 asterisks, which can only be identified because we have a copy which was owned of this catalog, which was owned by the French painter Gabriel de Saint-Aubin, and he made sketches of the busts shown by Houdon, all the busts shown by Houdon on this page. And you can recognize the 2 busts we've talked about, but also we are able to identify the portrait, the Madame de whatever, with this bust against a blue background that you see on the right. This bust has actually a strong connection to the Frick, because in 1916, it was presented by the Devine brothers, a dealing firm, to Henry Clay Frick for purchase. Frick was tempted by this bust. He kept it for 3 years in his home, but then was convinced by an art critic at the time, Charles Henry Hart, that this wasn't a genuine Houdon. Part of it had also to do with the identification of the sitter, because the Devines claimed that this was a portrait of La Clarion. La Clarion was a famous French 18th century actress, and actually she's not. We now know that this is Anne-Germaine Larrivée de Vermeneux, who was a famous, very rich widow in Paris at the time, who was friends with some of the most important intellectual circles of the city. She was very good friends, for example, with Diderot. But that wasn't known at the time. And Frick was persuaded by Hart that this wasn't a Houdon, that this was a fake. Hart claimed that this didn't breathe like a Houdon. So Frick rejected it after 3 years, sent it back to Devine, who had to lower the price. A lot of controversy ensued. The Devine brothers also sued Mr. Hart. They lowered the price and they eventually sold it to someone else, and it ended up in, now it's in the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, where you can still see it. And now it's universally accepted as one of the most beautiful marble portraits ever made by Houdon. But Frick unfortunately rejected it, and it is a pity also because we know that Frick only managed to acquire this one Houdon, the portrait of Madame du Cayla, during his lifetime. And he was so fond of it and liked it so much that when it came to having a portrait made of his own daughter, Ellen Clay Frick, he asked the American sculptor Malvina Hoffman to, and I quote, "do my daughter in the 18th century manner." And we see here that Malvina Hoffman really looked for inspiration at Madame du Cayla for her portrait of Helen Clay Frick. We don't really know why, but Helen Clay Frick later destroyed the marble version of this portrait. But fortunately, the plaster still survived, and it was given as a very generous gift to the Frick in 2016. So we still know what this looked like. Frick was very fond of Houdon, but he only, as I said, managed to acquire Madame du Cayla during his lifetime. But later on, after 1919, after his death, and after the opening of the museum in 1935, Frick managed to acquire a number of pieces by Houdon. You see the portrait of the Marquis de Miromesnil on the left here, the wonderful full-scale terracotta Diana the Huntress, one of the most outstanding technical achievements of sculpture of all times, that is now in the portico in the Frick Historic Building. You see it in the middle. And then much later, the Frick also got hold of this wonderful portrait of Madame His, which came as a gift, and you see it on the right. In 2007, it came as a gift. And there's also a smaller version of the Diane the Huntress in plaster, which is also the Frick. So overall, nowadays you can see 5 different pieces by Houdon at the Frick, which has become something of an international hub for the study of Houdon sculpture. So next time you come at the Frick, I hope you will spend some time looking at all the Houdons that you can find there, his Virtuoso, paying attention to his wonderful Virtuoso carving of them, but also especially spend some time in the company of this beguiling portrait of Madame du Cayla. Thank you for joining me tonight, and I'm looking forward to another episode of Cocktails with a Curator with you very soon. Goodbye.